It's very good and helpful for us to know that the Psalms have a story to tell as a whole. It's especially helpful as last week in Psalm 88, we ended up really in a place of darkness. And if you read sequentially through the Psalms, you'll find more despair in the next one, Psalm 89. By the end, because of all the trouble, the writer despairs that maybe God has given up on his promises. He accuses God. This is Psalm 89 at the end. This is what the psalmist says to God. You said, God, David's line will continue forever. But you've rejected, you have spurned, you have been very angry with your anointed one. You have renounced the covenant with your servant and have defiled his crown in the dust. See, in Psalm 89, are God's promises unfailing? Is he really faithful? It doesn't look like it. It looks like God gives up. David's crown is disgraced in the dust. But you promised, God. In Psalm 88 and 89, we learn there are really dark times for God's people. In fact, do you see, you can be one of God's chosen people, and yet it's possible your whole life might pass away without seeing much progress in terms of God's promises coming to fulfillment in your life through your immediate circumstances. You can be born, live a long life, and die with no real sign of hope in the progress of God's plan. Consider someone like Daniel, exiled to Babylon in 587 BC when Jerusalem was destroyed. Think of those people of Daniel's day who lived their whole life away from the promised land, away from the temple where their forefathers met with God. Daniel, well, he had his troubles and he prayed each day looking back to Jerusalem, but really he got off pretty well. He got a good job in his foreign land. But I'm sure there's many other Jews who aren't named, who just live their whole lives as exiles and refugees in that land, who passed away, died before the return to Jerusalem was decreed under King Cyrus of Persia 70 years later. They trusted God all their life, and yet they were burnt out in exile. Where was God's faithfulness to David and his people? Where was his everlasting throne? As their lives faded away in darkness still, was there any hope to be found? See, we start to feel the weight of Psalms 88 and 89 together. They're Psalms, as Tim said, they're Psalms of confusion, of a crisis of faith, crying out, how can this be? And this is where it's really helpful to know that and discover that there's a pattern to the collection of the Psalms as a whole. We tend to pluck them out and read them individually, and each one does have a distinct meaning of its own. But when we read them together in sequence, as we do with the other parts of the Bible, we notice there is a storyline that overarches the Psalms. And as you finish Psalm 89 and look forward to Psalm 90, you see a heading in your Bible, Book 4. And in my Bible, it gives the Psalms of Book 4, Psalms 90 to 106. See, the 150 Psalms are divided into 5 books. And this really gives us a hint that they are gathered together with a purpose. It's not just 150 randomly together. There's some meaning to the arrangement as a whole. The Psalms together tell a story. Each psalm was put with the others around it for a reason. And each book of the 5 books has a certain feel to it, or a theme. I've taken these titles for the 5 books from Robert Godfrey's book, Learning to Love the Psalms. Book 1, Psalms 1 to 41, Confidence in God's Care. Psalms 42 to 72, Book 2, Commitment to God's Kingdom. Book 3, Psalms 73 to 89, Crisis over God's Promises. Book 4, Psalms 90 to 106, Comfort in God's Faithfulness. And Book 5, Psalms 107 to 150, Celebration of God's Salvation. Yes, we notice there's still a variety of psalms in each book. Not every individual psalm fits perfectly with that theme, but still there is a general movement or feel across the 5 books of the Psalms. And this can actually help us with those difficult and dark psalms like 88 and 89, just at the end of Book 3. See, at times our lives might feel stuck in Book 3, constant crisis, wondering if God can possibly keep his promises, like it's all just going to end in darkness. But it's comforting to know that there's a bigger movement at work. There's a greater ending in store. The Psalms show us there is a bigger picture. After Book 3, there's Book 4. And the whole thing is moving towards salvation, comfort, celebration. And we know it finishes with great psalms of praise. That was the trajectory for Israel. Yes, there were some really dark days, and some Israelites lived their whole life through the worst of it. There were words of comfort, though, words from the prophets, words and promises of salvation. And really, this is the trajectory of our lives too. Our days may be exhausted in struggle and despair, clouded with very real doubts about the goodness of God and his faithfulness. But there's a bigger picture, we know, when we look to Christ and God's plan for comfort and salvation through him. That's the trajectory we follow through the Psalms. And so this week, as we move from Psalm 88 to Psalm 96, we move from crisis to comfort and towards the hope of celebration.